Episode number 40 of the WiLLcast was with CJ Smith of CD Smith.
Yes, he's legal counsel for CD Smith, which for anyone who doesn't know or isn't from the Fond du Lac area, they are a
large general contractor.
Yeah, very large, very, very large. They also do a lot of work in the Milwaukee area. We've seen a lot of cool projects down that way.
Yeah, they've done some really neat projects recently. I think the world's largest building or stick-built building made out of timber.
Yep, timber. Largest timber structure or tallest, I believe. I think it's the tallest. Yes.
Okay.
Which is down on downtown Milwaukee, I think towards the lakefront, actually.
But yeah, we talked about some of the fundamentals of the contracting process. What puts the contract in Contractor, how you go from contract to blueprints to all of the skilled tradespeople on the ground, filling in all the gaps, and also even aside from the contract, why relationships are important in that business.
That was a cool perspective to hear from him. As a lawyer, you think he'd be so dead set on the contract, being dialed in that much, but it was interesting because he does come from a construction family. He really appreciates the importance of the relationships with the different parties involved in a project, and also just so much respect for the boots on the ground, the guys, the laborers, and that skilled workforce. He has a lot of appreciation for them.
Everybody involved, the suppliers. We talked about some supply chain issues on the component side. I think this is a really good one for people that are in the construction business as a supplier, but maybe aren't always interacting with contractors, just to understand the framework of the industry. A public sector customer versus a private sector customer, the different types of contracts, really how projects start, who are subcontractors, the different types of delivery methods. It really had, I think, something for everybody if you're in the construction business.
It was, like I said, it was not only a unique perspective, but I think it also was a really good high-level look. It was a different angle to talk about everything that goes into some of these projects, and honestly, a lot of the stuff that I don't necessarily think about. So,
sure.
Yeah.
And this episode is brought to you by WiLLsport, which is Wisconsin Lighting Lab's indoor and outdoor sports lighting brand. We do baseball fields, football fields, tennis courts. We do pickleball courts, pretty much anything indoor and outdoor sports. And they're fun and exciting applications. We have control systems. We have color-changing systems. And if you're interested in connecting with us for your project, go to www.willbrands.com.
Yep, made in America products manufactured right here in Fond du Lac.
Made in Wisconsin.
Made in Wisconsin.
Well, cool. Enjoy episode number 40 with CJ Smith. So how'd you get interested in law? How far does that go back?
So that goes back probably just to college.
Okay.
I mean, a little bit before that, maybe, but really it was, I went to college. I went to Madison, and I'm studying political science and history because I really enjoy reading, and I got to do a lot of reading, which is pretty lame. But that's how it panned out. So I'm studying, the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, the Federalist Papers, all of these things, and then that's the U.S. side. On the international side, it's like, okay, why is England the way it is? Why is Japan the way it is? And it all comes down to the way that for me at least, the way that their society is organized around a set of laws. We call it the Constitution. It's called a number of different things elsewhere. But then I'm thinking, okay, well, so the people are kind of making this agreement with their government as to why they are going to act the way they are in this really strange, long tentacled way. And, why is that? And then I was working for this lobbyist.
So this was still as an undergrad with a poli-sci major?
Right.
Okay.
Poli-sci major, kind of undecided, but, leaning that way first couple of years. And then I was working for this lobbyist, and we would be reading Wisconsin state statutes, and, okay, how can we make this better for our clients? And it'd be kind of writing words in and thinking about how just these simple little changes could make a big difference across the state that people might not know about unless you're really into it. And I thought that was really cool. So I'm thinking to myself, all right, I can either keep going down this path and be a lobbyist, which I thought was fun, but a little too queasy dirty for me.
Yeah, there's a negative connotation.
Yeah, and
with lobbyists, even they do have important role in representing their constituency, but it's in recent years there's a negative connotation.
Right, and then I was lucky because the people that I worked for, I mean, they were representing the grocers in Wisconsin, so pretty salt of the earth people.
Pretty easy to get behind that.
Yeah,
that group.
you're not going to be pissed at people for wanting to sell cheaper groceries.
Yeah.
Right. So that it was at least a heartwarming thing to do.
Sure.
But on the other side, if you get too deep into that, there's a whole another series of doors that you can open, and all of a sudden you're working for people maybe who you don't want to work for, which is, I guess, the same in any profession, but a little less under the public eye.
So you kind of understood the framework of how states and countries are set up. How to some degree how politics is structured. It's interesting hearing that because from my view, we're in the construction business, but we're we're relatively far removed from the actual building of the buildings. We're supplying components to electrical contractors who are supplying components to companies like C.D. Smith, and even though we're only a few layers removed in terms of understanding the structure of how construction works, from the contract side of it to the different types of delivery methods to what's a general contractor, what's a subcontractor, and just the term contract in Contractor. What was that like to understand that process, coming from the mindset of understanding kind of the way things are set up at the state level and then getting into the industry?
Yeah, so I like to say that the word contract and contractor, it's the most important part, right? It's the most important part of the whole business, really, is understanding the contract. I say that jokingly, but that's the way I feel.
It's in the name.
It's in the name. It's right in there in the word. You have to take that bigger structure of how the state, federal government works, and then you boil it down to, okay, that's on a really grand scale, but the same principles kind of apply
Absolutely.
as you get down lower. And so I really enjoy finding out as a company, what can we agree to with someone else and define our relationship that way. We can start a whole new relationship, and we can get it all in writing. Think of the possibilities, right? So getting to that point was, I think, my favorite thing as a law student, as a young lawyer, as now, I guess, an experienced lawyer. Understanding the entire gamut of a project. You look at a project and you probably have 5, maybe 10 entities who are doing some sort of designing or engineering. You have 1, maybe 2 general contractors, ideally just 1, and then 30, 40, 50 other entities who are performing work on the job site in small specialized trades. And
that's before even getting to the supply chain.
Right. Before you have your material men, before you have the suppliers to those material men, before you have the professional services who come in and inspect those things. So you have to find a way to take all of these different entities and mold them into one deliverable contract to the owner where you say...
To build something that has never existed before.
Right.
Buildings are always one of one. Manufacturing is repeatability, whereas a building, I mean, maybe you can build a couple of them if it's a standardized spec house, but the stuff you guys work on typically is one of one.
It is. And, I've always had great admiration for people who could look at a series of lines and numbers on a piece of paper and take that and build it into something that's coming out of the ground. I was really lucky in the construction sense that my dad was a superintendent, and I got to watch him occasionally on site, but I would hear stories about, what he's doing on different sites, and some from him, some from other people. And I always thought that was just the greatest thing ever. So you're telling me there's this roll of paper and you spread it out over a desk, and 18 months later, it's a sewer, it's a wastewater treatment plant.
It's so cool.
And it's operating, it's benefiting an entire community, and you were the one who said, drive that stake here, build that wall there. And, I would do that. I mean, I still think it's amazing.
It is.
I look at the
especially
guys,
as things become more complicated.
Right.
Buildings, control systems, plumbing systems, everything is way more complicated than it was 50 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I look at those guys the guys that we have in the field, guys and girls, who work in the field, and now they're not even looking at the paper, but they have their iPads or their tablets, and it's showing a 3D rendering of the building. And they can still look at that, and it's never, you always have to envision some of it in your mind and look at the space that's empty and know where things are going to go based on what you're seeing on the screen or on a paper. And I think that's just incredible work to do. Way more important than reading a contract, I guess. If we're really going to get into it, I'd admit it.
Well, I think there's two really interesting things to focus on just from that. One is to dive in a little bit more on just the flow of information on a construction project, starting with the owner. What are their requirements? What's their vision? What are they trying to get out of the project? It gets distilled down to an architectural team, a design team, starting to put together a master plan, starting to pull in, you said 10 to 15 different parties even on the design side before it even gets to a contractor. So I'd like to, kind of pick your brain in that process, but also talk about the contract. You'd talked about how important the contract is, and then at the same time too, all the people in the field, they're using a guideline, aka blueprint, like with a bunch of lines, and filling in all of these gaps and this information without any contract. And it's kind of two different worlds within the same business. So, if you think about a small project, medium sized project, large project that you guys work on, how does that usually start? When do you guys get involved? What is kind of the discovery process look like with the owner? Kind of dive into that.
Sure. So I guess there's two ways that starts, and in the first way I would say is in a public and a publicly opened live bid job, and the second way would be a negotiated job, which can take two main forms. One would be just a design bid build where the owner has the design, they send it to an architect, and then the general contractor works with the architect to do the owner's program. The second would be a design build where the architect is actually under the contractor, and the owner really talks to the contractor, gives us all of their requirements, their specifications, their hopes and wishes, and we work with that architect to deliver that whole project. But on the public side, the contract is a really simple process because you don't have a choice. You get the documents from the municipality, from the agency, from whoever it is. You review it, you think, okay, yeah, we could probably do this. There's some risk in this language, but we can't change it, so we got to factor that into our numbers a little bit. And then we would send that overall document down to the subcontractors who were hoping to bid on the job. We take their numbers, put them all into one aggregate bid, send it into that municipality along with 4 or 5 other people who have done the same thing. And, low bidder wins so long as it's responsible. And if you are the low bidder, a week or so later, you get the contract in the mail, says sign here, don't change anything. And you sign it and send it back, and 2 weeks after that, you get a notice to proceed and you start working.
So the folks putting the requirements together on behalf of the end user's vision, in this case a public entity, do they work for the public entity, and they've spent a few years understanding what the local geo wants, and are they working on behalf, or are they working for the public entity itself?
A lot of times they're working on behalf. So
okay.
if I'm thinking of a wastewater treatment facility, so we have one right now in Sheboygan. It's a really cool job where some of the piping for the wastewater is going out like 2 miles into Lake Michigan. So you think about how specialized of a subcontractor you have to be to put piping out 2 miles, but for another time. They'll have a separate engineering company just take the process from the start years before we ever get involved. And the engineer will work with that municipality who probably builds one project like that every 20 years. So there's really no need for them to specialize in it. And in that case, most of our interaction is with the engineer. The contract is with the municipality because they're ultimately going to pay for it, but the engineer is really running the show. On the other hand, if you're working for something like the state of Wisconsin, where you have, take a Celery Hall project, UW-Madison Celery Hall, big dorm down on the southeast side. But the state of Wisconsin had just built Whitty Hall, which we were lucky enough to be on. They do tons of college campus facilities year after year. So they have a whole in-house department that just does the Division of Facilities Development. They do buildings. And they'll hire an architect, but the specialization and the direction is really coming from the state on that point because they do enough volume work where they can specialize.
They've done it before. They have a starting point,
right,
at least. Yep.
So the state's the expert there.
Yep.
But if the municipality is more of a one-off project, then they hire out and you work directly with the engineer. So if you have a state project, yeah, you're working with the architect because that's who you're doing all your submittals to. That's who's really overseeing the work, but you also have to realize that the state is the ultimate boss, and there's a little more interaction on that side. So
does CD Smith have a Rolodex of super specialized subcontractors for very unique situations that you can put in touch with the engineer in charge or the person running the project? And I would imagine oftentimes the more specialized, the more the wider the geography the company has to cover. So you may have to pull in somebody from California or Texas or out of state to work on a local project.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a Rolodex. Right now it's more of just an online database. And
yeah.
I think it's called the Plan Room, where we are able to solicit bids from those specialty contractors, and those specialty contractors will, through their business representatives, sign up and make themselves available to receive those bids. So for instance, we had on that Sheboygan job, the contractor who's doing the piping, I think they're in Michigan, on the other side of the lake. We had a job in Milwaukee doing this Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra renovation, big job, historic rehab.
Such a cool job.
Right?
I was living in Milwaukee at the time.
Okay.
That was awesome.
So it's done now.
Yeah.
Right. But one of the things we had to do there was, because the job relied on historic tax credits to get some funding, we had to move one of the walls of the existing theater, I want to say 100 feet back, and it's a multi-ton wall. So there's not many people who do that, and I think the subcontractor came out of Oklahoma, or I'm probably wrong, but
it's
this is something that they do.
It's an art piece, essentially,
Yeah.
as a building, too.
Yeah.
So.
And I think there's some Art Deco
Yeah.
masonry on the backside. You can't, if it crumbles, all of these historic tax credits are gone.
Yeah.
And the job has a catastrophic failure. So we had this one specialty contractor who, and this is what they do. You wouldn't believe that there's a contractor who moves walls, but they do. And they had all this steel rigging that they had pressed against the wall so that it was stable, and then they would just kind of scooted it back across these big giant I-beams and got it in place, and it was awesome. I mean, we had some really cool time-lapse video of it, but they backed this wall up so that there was more room on the stage, and then you build back into that wall, and it turned out great. But I guess that's one of the things that we do, is we take on these big giant challenges, but we do it in a measured approach. We spent a lot of time thinking about it, made sure that we had all the permits to do it, because we're going into the middle of a working road in the city of Milwaukee, which is not easy to do, but spent a lot of time, did a lot of planning. Everything worked out about as well as it could. I think we did it in half the time that we thought it was going to take, which is always...
That always happens,
It's
right?
always a plus, yeah. So that's one of those specialty contractors that you don't have on a Rolodex, but you got to find, because you're not going to wing it.
So what the contract in those cases, or just really any case, so the contract attempts to take the customer requirements and formalize them into like an executable, something you can execute on from a contract standpoint. Does your team get involved with every project? Do you guys have kind of standardized type documents for more standardized projects, and then as part of the sales process or the bid process, the legal team gets involved to help tailor it to the project?
Right. So if we're on a negotiated project, we'll start off with an AIA contract, typically. And AIA is the American Institute of Architects, and they have a form contract that's basically the industry standard for general contractors working with an architect and an owner. And it's, I don't know, it's about 80 pages long when all is said and done, which isn't too bad. And we'll take that, and it's a standard form. I have the modifications that I put in all the time for every job just to give ourselves some baseline protection. If you can imagine, it's an AIA document, so it's really good for the architects. It's not especially great for the contractors, so we go back and kind of switch some of the things around. And then early on in the project, if we're dealing with a sophisticated enough owner, they'll have legal representation because they're also doing lending, they're doing real estate purchasing, they're structuring their entity the way that they want it, and then they say, okay, yeah, send us the contract, because if we're doing a bank loan, we have to provide it to the bank anyways. So we might as well get it out of the way. And then we'll send it to their legal team, depending on how much of a fuss they want to make. You know, we could spend a month going back and forth on the contract. You know, luckily, I've been in my position long enough where now I have fairly decent relationships with a lot of the lawyers that these people hire, especially out of Milwaukee or Madison, and we can brush through most of it pretty quick.
There's at least a level of trust to some degree.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, sometimes some of the changes are just, okay, we know you're going to do it this way. Let's just put it on paper. Whereas if we're trying to do a little bit more freewheeling, you can just tell someone, yeah, we'll send you all of this information, but we don't need to formalize it. You know, we don't need to do that. Over time, if you develop trust with an owner, then you can do that because it's a repeat customer. You know that the relationship is the contract. It's whatever you have in writing isn't really going to matter as much as, hey, we want to keep working with you. We've done 10 projects together. Let's make it 15. We don't want to ruin this over some line that some lawyer, put in the contract to protect ourselves. We'll ignore that. Let's find the root of the problem and we'll solve it. So that then you have to make a judgment call. Is that the type of owner you're on now, or are you dealing with someone who you've never met before? It's a new area for them. You're not quite sure how they're going to react to certain situations. Maybe keep the protection in. So there's always this give and take, and as we become more sophisticated, or as the buildings get more sophisticated, unfortunately, you have to make the word a little more, the wording a little more sophisticated, and that's good for me. But if all goes well, you take the contract, you finalize it. You always say you put it in a drawer, and we're not going to see it again ever. And that's the ideal situation.
So do you think that contracts, because of how complicated buildings are getting, do you think they're getting the point where, fewer and fewer people can actually understand the spirit of the contract and the spirit of what's trying to be done? And or it's kind of, as things get more complicated and then the contracts become more complicated, there's a little bit of a lag in understanding, but eventually people catch up?
Yeah, I think part of it is the contract, and part of it is just the level of detail that goes into the specifications of a project.
I see.
Because the contract is, 80 pages, but then the real meat of it is these really hyper-detailed specifications that the architect or the engineer will put together, that when you're the contractor in the field, you have to go through and look at. Okay, so I have this wall, it's load bearing. I need to have, steel studs. They need to be rated to ANSI standard. What I need to make sure that's going in there. Okay, how many screws do I need? That sort of thing. That's where the real detail comes in. And as a contractor, as you do that more often, you know what those are, and you don't have to look at them quite as often. But as the buildings become more and more sophisticated, I think that's where the big detail is going to come in. But luckily, we have a lot of very experienced people running our jobs to where it's second nature to them, and they can look at a plan and specification and say, okay, this is I can see this just based off of the style, based off the word, that this is a such and such an architect. This is ABC architect, or this is XYZ architect. I know what they're going to want. I know how to get that in. I've worked with them before. And let's start building. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, oftentimes what we see as a lighting and controls manufacturer and supplier is we get pulled in so far after the specifications are created, where all of this upfront work happens with the architect, the engineers, the contractors, the project managers, and what the requirements state. Only 25% of the lighting and controls requirements are even possible to build them. So, and when we like yesterday, I was working on a military project, and requirements document was 120 pages long. So, and we get forwarded an email thread from a sales rep or a distributor, and they say, quote this. And it's like, okay, where do we dive in? 99.9% of the requirements aren't even related to the lighting.
Right.
But they're indirectly related. So what we oftentimes do is, we don't even want to read through the document initially. It's put us in touch with the engineer or the architect, where you don't necessarily start over, but you try and get the spirit of the requirement and kind of recalibrate with them, because ideally we would have been pulled in 12 to 18 months earlier, but that doesn't always happen. What further complicates it is all the supply chain issues right now.
Sure.
So everybody on the planet, all through the supply chain, they're having to substitute alternate parts. And, in theory, that affects things too. So it's just interesting to hear you kind of talk about how much upfront work over the course of many, many years happens before a lot of the supply chain gets pulled in.
Right, before everything goes amok. So I think about these supply chain issues, and that's why one of the contract sections that we talk about a lot is, okay, what are we allowed to do for substitutions? Or if there's a supply chain issues, what steps do we have to go to give notice to the owner, to give notice to the engineer, to give ourselves the contractual right to change an item out? So one of the things, I'm sure you've run into this, is there will be a specified part, and it's on the critical path of a job, and you bid it out in March, right? And the subcontractor says, yeah, we can get that. And then by the time the owner finalizes the contract, allows us to issue a subcontract, it's June, and you get the response, no, that's not available anymore. And you go, well, why? They just don't make it. We've had these goofy things come up where the supplier will say, well, you remember that ice storm in Texas from October of 2020? Well, that's where all of this product was made, and the chemical was stored in this one building that lost power, and now there's no more chemical available. And so all of these products they're just off the table. So then you either have a really good owner who says, okay, I recognize that, let's find an alternate, or you have an owner that says, I don't care, you got to supply it, and then you get into contractually, okay, how do we give ourselves more time to finish this? Because if we don't have it now and we have to have it, it's just going to take a while to recover, and we don't know what that is.
And what's interesting with that is there's a lot of press with Ford and some of the larger manufacturers that were switching to EVs and or just the electrification of just more systems in their vehicles. There's 57 microcontrollers in the F-150, and if one microcontroller, if there's supply chain issues, you have to shut down a whole assembly line. And you think about on construction projects and all the construction projects across the entire U.S. or the entire world, there are probably tens of thousands of microcontrollers in some of these buildings, and you can probably build a building with and maybe leave one room unfinished.
Yep.
But it's interesting the scale that you guys work on when it comes to supply chain. Every single thing that's happening at the owner's level gets multiplied by the 10 subcontractors who have 10 different suppliers, and they all need their supply chains to work on time. It's kind of mind-boggling that it actually works even during good supply times.
Right. And then you think of that, and then you think of, okay, but on a global scale, we are just small potatoes, right? So we've had issues where, and it was an electrical switchgear component, where all of a sudden we were notified we couldn't get it for like a year because it's all hung up in China and they just can't get it out of the country. So then our question for the supplier was, okay, what if we give you $50,000 to get it on the next container ship over?
Yeah.
Can we get that
air freight
it over? And I think the supplier said, you could try, but Ford needs these same components, and Ford is going to pay $1 billion to get it on the next container over.
It's one of the unintended consequences of everything that's happened the last 2 years is when there's a supply or a manufacturing crunch, the biggest bidders and the biggest companies get all the parts.
Right.
It's just what happens. So, and we've seen it in our industry where, some of the small suppliers, the mom and pop, the fab shops, people that did very unique things similar to a specialty contractor, the same concept at least, they had to rely on the supply chain to do its job to stay in business, because you can't design the part, run the machine, manage all the supply chain, do everything, and all of a sudden everything changes every hour of every day because of supply chain issues. So I think there's been a lot of smaller companies that unfortunately are really struggling because of that exact situation.
Absolutely.
It's definitely been a challenge that we've seen with a lot of suppliers. So so you talked about on a global scale, one of the things Tesla has been doing is they're becoming more and more vertically integrated, where a lot of other manufacturers, the trend over the last few decades was to outsource, make parts to your spec, outsource, send a part and have a bunch of different people bid on it. They're doing more vertical integration, and they've been able to weather a lot of the supply chain issues because they're so vertically integrated. Do you see in contracting or in building any trends towards that, where contractors are trying to do more of the design, maybe do some self-performing some of the work that they used to not self-perform, even getting into manufacturing? I know, for instance, like Ahern here in town, they do some manufacturing as well, and they do some install. But what does that look like in the general contracting space?
Yeah, that's tough because there's just such a wide variety of materials that have to come in and supplies that come in. But we're a company that's always prided ourselves on self-performing a lot of work. If you look at from our earliest days, labor-intensive work, took a lot of pride in that.
Yeah,
we've had a lot of really good workers who are able to take that on and show a lot of pride in that. And that's why one of the reasons why we support union work, one of the reasons why we support apprentices as soon as you can find a trade, is because we self-perform our masonry, we self-perform our steel, we self-perform concrete, we do a lot of carpentry. So that allows us to have a competitive edge over other GCs who would have to sub that out.
I see. Where they're managing almost all of they're subbing out almost all the labor, where you guys are doing a lot more of that in-house.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So if we're going to go back to a contract, from a contractual side, it makes it easier for us, because instead of having 5 different subcontracts for these small little areas, we can just do it all ourselves.
Yep.
And you don't have to go through the hassle of, okay, well, now our masonry subcontractor is telling us they're delayed, so we have to deal with it. Where for us, it's our masonry superintendent is saying he doesn't have enough guys, let's pull from this other job and we'll just get it done ourselves.
Yep.
So it's a tremendous advantage. Some of the things that we see is automation of certain tasks. We've been investing in some of the machinery that will make it easier to get supplies. I'm thinking of supplies like mortar directly to where a mason needs it. So instead of having mortar on the ground and then having to haul it up, you can pump it right to the delivery of the block. We were one of the early investors in concrete pumping trucks, or you see them all the time now, but 10, 20 years ago, they were pretty rare, where you see the your big concrete delivery vehicles with the big barrel that rolls around. It delivers it into a hopper, and that hopper is attached to a truck with a big giant boom that will reach over into a building. That was a huge innovation. Back in the day, it was pour the concrete into a bucket, swing that bucket by a crane over the building, pull a lever on the bucket dumps in, and you got to puddle it out and then repeat the process over and over again. So as far as vertically integrating the materials, man, that would be tough. I just don't have the imagination for that. I'm sure it's possible, but we're always looking for the next big thing, because if you're not innovating, you're dying. So we're looking constantly toward how can we become more efficient in our work. And if you're more efficient, you can lower your prices, you can get more work. So it's always a big investment place for us.
Certainly. Well, is there anything else you want to touch on? I see quite a few notes there.
Yeah, well, Becca told me that we were going to be talking about the history of construction law, so I did a lot of research.
Okay, to clarify, Adam told Becca to tell CJ that we'd be talking about
law history.
We can get into that. That's not just the Wikipedia page, is it?
No, I have
Went
this
back
journal,
to your textbooks.
The Mitchell Hamline School of Law Review Journal, Volume 34, Issue 1, 2007. No, going back to Hammurabi's Code, eye for an eye, that sort of thing. But the history it all deals with the intersection of real estate law, real property law, and then just basic contract law, which covers every agreement you have between two people. But real property law is how does your actions affect the land you're working on. One of the fun things that we do is if we have a tower crane, or if we have a crane that's running over another project or another piece of real estate, you have to find easement rights over that land, because if you own property, in theory, you own the property all the way up to the sky.
I was going to say, what is the vertical, I guess the horizontal plane, how high does that go?
It goes all the way up.
Okay.
All the way up. So
doesn't the FAA take over some of that space?
At some point they do. Okay. Yeah, but I mean, in theory, the jumbo jets are trespassing all the time.
You can't license the sky. I mean, I guess some people probably license the sky.
Probably can at some point. Air rights, sunlight rights, those kind of things are.
Man, that's so interesting.
It's a really specific area that typically you don't think of, but it's a thing. As far as other highlights, C.D. Smith as a company here in town, we do have a CDS Gives Back program. We do a lot to support the community, which has been very, very beneficial to us. So we're always looking for ways to funnel some of that goodwill back. We have, I don't know how soon this will air, but we do have the Walleye Weekend. There's a new building block zone that's going up. We're sponsored it for young kids. We work a lot with the ACE Academy here in town to try to get more kids into the trades, not just because it's good for us, but because it's
good for the community.
It's
right?
good for a community. It's good for people who maybe don't want to go to college, and I think college certainly is not for everyone. I think you see more of a push of that these days than there was.
That's a common theme on the podcast. Is just it isn't for everybody, and there are a lot of people that were pressured to do it, over the last few decades, and it's great. It's a great option for people. But as you said, to go to the trades or go to tech school or go right from high school, do a work program with a local contracting company. There's a lot of options,
right? I mean, I think there's a direct correlation between this giant push we've had in the 20 years to go to college and these insane college tuition rates.
Yeah.
And the insane student debt, which is awful. I
completely agree.
I would have loved to have this push to relieve student debt, I don't know, 5 years ago?
Yeah.
10 years ago? I still don't think they're actually going to, discharge all of it, but it'd be pretty wild
Seems
if they did.
Like it would be tough.
Yeah. It's a tough sell.
And then also just the connection to, for every, 5 people getting out of the trades, there's only a couple people replacing them. I mean, that also is a direct connection to the 4-year push.
Adam, where were we that, I think I was with you, the stat about it's like 1 out of every 3 high school students or high school seniors doesn't have a plan.
I think it may have been the Envision
dinner. Yes.
The Envision event.
So when you're talking about things like promoting the tech, it also, to me, it sounds like you're keeping a workforce in Fond du Lac.
Right.
You're not having people, if you're promoting the local trades and things like that, kids that maybe would go out, move to Oshkosh, Milwaukee, Madison, wherever, you're trying to keep them local.
Yeah, and they're good paying jobs.
Right.
They're great paying jobs, especially as there has been a, labor shortage. You can make a good living doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it on the podcast, but labor has a lot of power right now.
Yeah.
I mean, as opposed to 20 years ago, when employment management had basically the whole say. Right now, it's totally flipped. Becca and I were at that event with Envision. Was it a month ago?
A little bit ago, yeah.
And one of the messages that we're giving the kids is, if you find something that you're able to do, you can get paid for it anywhere.
Yeah.
People are willing to pay for talent, for content, and you don't have to be sitting in an office doing it. And if if you're not making money right now as a college kid, or if you don't have a number of offers that you're considering, just move to a different place. It's simple,
right.
or just reach out differently.
Yeah, I mean,
can be tougher in manufacturing the trades.
Certainly is. Certainly is.
But the remote workforce piece of the puzzle for these high school kids, we did a networking breakfast with local high school. I think they're all juniors and seniors.
Right.
And a lot of them, I don't think they fully understood the shift that happened, and why would they? But with COVID, the ability to work remotely and not have to go into an office once a week or ever is so great. And they're talking about moving and going different places. It's like, no, you don't have to. You can stay right here and work for a company in New York, and they will pay you as if you're working in New York.
Yeah, the option to stay in, if we're plugging Fond du Lac, it's a community that I dearly, dearly love.
Because you left. You were in
I
Boston,
left. I was
right?
gone,
Yeah.
came back. All roads lead back to Fond du Lac. But the fact that you could be a tax-paying citizen in the city of Fond du Lac and not be working for a Fond du Lac company, to me, is still just wild. But on the other hand, if you're interested in the trades, you can be based out of Fond du Lac, and if you're working for a company like us, we can put you in housing. If we have a job, say in La Crosse, and you're working out of La Crosse, we can put you in housing in La Crosse. So now you're not even paying for rent. You can still be headquartered for yourself in Fond du Lac, living in La Crosse, working at La Crosse, earning not only your wages, but a per diem. And if you're 22, 23, even younger than that, and that's your whole income, I mean, that's crazy. That's on the pathway to your boat, to your up north cabin, to your fancy big truck by the time you're 25.
So those are some of the things you've done to kind of apply some of the remote work concepts to the trades labor, is just offer flexibility and housing and those things.
We've done that. I mean, that's something that we've done. Shoot, I mean, I remember going to Beloit and Algoma, and my dad would be in a house there with his whole crew working on a wastewater plant. And, I mean, that gives rise to tens of thousands of stories of of the fun that they would have working. But that's just one of the nice things working for a company like C.D. Smith that's headquartered very strongly in Fond du Lac. We have work all over the state.
Pretty central.
We can get people there. And if you're willing, if you're not afraid of work, which I think it is a good trait to have no matter what field you're in, but if you're not afraid of work, you can have a very steady job. You can rise in a company, get to a leadership position if you want it. You can, and certainly in our company, this is how we try to promote from within. You can be a leader in your field. You can be an expert in your field. You can be a very valued member of our workforce. And you can do it without student debt. You can do it on an apprentice program where you're getting paid to learn your trade, which is awesome. It's not something that you can typically get in a professional field, but that's what you are. You're a professional with a viable trade. and you're getting paid for it. That option is incredible. So we try to get that in front of students at all the schools that we work at, with a youth apprentice program or with, the ACE Academy here in Fond du Lac, which is incredible. They have an incredible building. And that's a message that we love to give.
No, that's great perspective. I appreciate you sharing that. It sounds like that stuff, you guys kind of had that rolling for a number of years, and then it's probably been accelerated, I would imagine 2008, 2009 during the first Great Recession where, contractors, it seemed like had to go to wider geographies to find work. And now with, the pandemic, seems like it's accelerated even further.
Yeah, there were lean times there.
Yeah.
But I think what happened for us is that we kept the really good guys and we found ways to keep them employed.
Yep.
If it meant we had
it's very
3,
important.
4, 5 superintendents on a job, it would have to happen because we don't want to lose those guys.
Yep.
And now we have this really strong, we call them our core employees, who are incredible at what they do, and they're now teaching others how to do the same thing.
Yep. Well, man, that's great perspective, and you guys are a great company here in Fond du Lac and in Wisconsin. And thanks for all you do, and thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's talk again.
Times.